Keeping it nice and simple, but at the same time trying something new. I'm going to have a friend of mine call in to review our last Netflix party, and I'm also going to reveal my top 10 films of the 1970s. I'm Joe Acierno. This is Real Talk. Okay, so to start off the show, I have my dear friend Jordon Alagna calling in to review a movie that the two of us enjoyed for the Netflix party, the new feature, of course, from Netflix that I've been using or we've all been using to enjoy ourselves and spend quality time with people during this whole coronavirus epidemic. Jordan, how you doing today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm about the same considering the circumstances, but you know what? We're making the most of it. This could be so much worse. So I'm glad you're on with me today. This movie that we watched is called End of Watch, and it was directed and written by David Ayer and stars Jake Gyllenhaal and Michael Pena. Now, you were the one that was definitely more enthusiastic about this going in because you'd seen this movie before. So you want to just A, say what the movie is about, and then B, why exactly you were so enthusiastic about recommending this to us?
Yeah, so the movie is just about two police officers named Brian Taylor and Mike Zavala, who, it chronicles their day-to-day lives as police officers and best friends. They're partnered up, and they go on to town in South Los Angeles to take down bad guys, and eventually they end up finding some really, really messed up stuff that ends up having them have a hit on them, and it's their entire story, their day-to-day lives as police officers.
Okay, so now, why exactly were you so enthusiastic about this? Like, what made you want to recommend this to us?
Honestly, it's one of those police movies that doesn't focus on the corruption of police officers and just shows, like, the real work that goes into it. Personally, for me, I've interned at a police department, and a lot of the work that they do, it really is just sitting down, doing that paperwork, and then, going out there and trying to catch the bad guys. Obviously, it's a little bit dramatized. But then the other aspect of it, too, that a lot of other police movies we don't see is their real lives outside of the uniform. You get to see what they do outside of it.
Yeah, it gives them that much more depth when, you put as much of a focus on, the regular day-to-day. It kind of uncartoonizes it all, It kind of, I feel like in a lot of other movies when, they don't put the sort of personal emphasis like they do in this movie, it glosses over certain things that end up adding a lot to the story of the characters, and they didn't do that in this movie, which made me appreciate that very much.
Very true. Especially, the moments when they're in the car and their dash cam is recording them and they're just joking around, and then all of a sudden, it just completely switches over to a complete serious tone because something is coming up. And it's just that it's the realistic thing where in an instant, it can just go from super funny to super serious just like that. It really captures the reality of what it's like to be a police officer.
Now, touching upon something you said with, their dashboard cam being on, one of the things that I want to touch on is the found footage, I know English, found footage aesthetic where found footage technique that was used to bring this film to life. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts were on that exactly.
It makes it feel more real. Mm-hmm. It makes you really feel like, you're like there with them. You're there with them. You're feeling everything they're feeling. You're seeing them do all this crazy stuff that normal people wouldn't have to do, if they weren't a police officer. It made you feel like you were just there with them. That's the best way I can describe it.
Now, I kind of wish I answered that question first before you because you kind of read my mind and said exactly everything that I was going to say. But no, it definitely has this very, like you said, realistic and very down-to-earth quality about it all. And it definitely ramps up the intensity, too, because it ramps up the realism. Everything just kind of feels, I don't know if I'd say that it feels very uninterrupted. Because, again, it does cut back and forth between the two guys. It cuts back and forth between a lot of things, which again I think you need in something like this because there's only so much that you can get from the point of view of of one police body cam. But when you first told us about the film and I first watched the trailer, I'm like, okay, let me at least watch this. Let me know what I'm getting myself into because I had heard about this movie a while ago. Then I saw in the trailer that I'm like, oh shit, this is found footage. It's a found footage of a police officer movie. This is actually really interesting. This gives it a whole another element that I didn't expect to see coming and I think could work really well with something like this. And I think for the most part, this does add a lot to the film. Exactly what we were saying. Like, it makes you feel like you're right there with them. And again, it kind of ramps up the blood pressure, at least it did for me. It ramped up my blood pressure just a bit more because it felt like, I was a fly on the wall or a fly on the dashboard, depending on how you want to say. One thing I will say as far as like the found footage, like I said, I think it was definitely a great way to go about telling the story, but there's certain times where it kind of felt out of place. It kind of felt like, okay, like there are scenes where like, they're following, there are certain scenes that involve like, the cartel that goes after these two police officers, and they had the found footage in those scenes, but it just felt kind of weird for me that like, you just have one of these guys like out of nowhere just recording everything that these guys, these other guys, these cartel members are saying. Like, okay, not for nothing, last I checked, cartels don't want to exactly make a big name for themselves. They don't exactly want to leave behind a lot of evidence. Why are you recording everything? You fucking idiot.
That was the one thing about the movie I'd say. I was just like, dude, are you serious right now?
Just like, what a stupid thing to do.
I was like, you're either brand new or you're just a complete moron.
You're brand new. I like that one better. You're brand new. You really don't know exactly what it is you're doing. But going back to like exactly how they, show everything in the movie, how they tell the story. Again, this is very much a movie that pulls no punches. It's very gruesome. It's very intense. Like certain things that like there's certain images that I'm not gonna be able to forget for a while. Like a knife in someone's eye, or someone's face literally getting pounded in, or like just certain things that they find. And I don't want to give away too much to those who haven't seen this 8-year-old movie, but there are certain things that, or really just this is one of those movies where it makes that much more of a difference if you know next to nothing going into it.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's why it's funny. One of our friends was actually texting me like, what's gonna happen? Like, what's going on? I'm just like, listen, I'm not saying anything. It's a movie. You just gotta watch it. Just the shock value that you just don't see it coming. It just hits you. Yeah. It's all like, and then even when you do get to that point, they move past it. You just got to run away. You just keep going to do what they have to do. They can't just sit there and take care of that person. They just got to run.
Yep.
It's just the intensity.
The intensity really is. This is definitely not a movie for the faint of heart, for sure. And going back to what you said about like when certain things hit you, they really hit you, and without giving away too much, of course. The ending in particular, I thought was very powerful, and this goes back to the whole character dynamic between Brian Taylor and Michael Zavalta. Am I getting his last name right? Michael Zavalta? Zavala, thank you. Zavala. Going back to the dynamic that they developed between these two, as much as they're individual characters themselves, I don't know how much I feel like, their individual characters and personalities really popped off the screen, unless they were trying to go for, like, an everyman, like, quality, which I think, depending on what they were going for, that works for this movie. But what made me really care was the dynamic that these two guys had for each other. And that made it made you care that much more. It made it that much more scary that you don't want this bond to be severed in any way, shape, or form.
I have to say that was the main reason why I love this movie so much. It's just a completely different perspective from everything else that you normally see in a cop movie. Their bond makes it's the best part of this entire movie. Mm-hmm. It's the best part by far. With that, I have to say, I honestly think that without these two characters in the movie, this movie would not be as good as it was.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like necessarily these two characters separately, but these two characters together. These two characters together, this movie wouldn't have been nearly as good as it was. This movie has a lot more heart than I originally thought it was going to. Again, going into this movie, but again, even just the scenes where they're just joking around with each other, which are honestly, they're freaking hilarious too. This is a very unexpectedly funny movie too. Just the scenes where they're joking around with each other to the scenes where they're in a very dire situation and they don't know what's going to happen next, but at the same time, they're still very much looking out for each other. That is the heart and soul of this movie, and for me, honestly, that's probably the biggest anchor of this movie.
I agree with you 1,000% on that. Oh, man. I'm still thinking about it, just...
It was rough, and I gotta say, I just want to talk about just like one little negative before I get back more to the positive. Again, this is very nitpicky, I know, on my end. There's certain cuts that I didn't like, and again, just like cutting from certain angles, they just felt like jump cuts, and they kind of just hit my eye the wrong way. But I thought for the most part, like, again, going back and forth between, like, the found footage, the different found footage angles, I thought it was seen together pretty well, even though there were certain jump cuts, or at least cuts that felt like jump cuts that I wasn't as crazy about. But going back to the whole character dynamics, that wouldn't have been nearly as strong if it wasn't for the performances and chemistry from Jake Gyllenhaal and Michael Pena. They're a very good duo together.
Very, very. And it still I'm sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but it makes me laugh that Michael Pena went from that to doing Louise from Ant-Man.
Which, I'm going to be honest, you know my opinion on Ant-Man 1. Ant-Man 2 I thought was much better, huge improvement, but Ant-Man 1, he annoyed the shit out of me. I was not crazy about Ant-Man 1 as a movie in general, but I'm going to be honest, he in that movie was kind of a let. I don't know if I'm going to say let down, but he was a hole in the ship for sure.
I can see your point of view on that. I definitely can.
But no, I think honestly, and again, because he usually he plays more comedic roles for sure, Michael Pena. But honestly, in this movie, he was very, very solid. Again, I love it when more comedic actors are able to pull off something more dramatic and really just run away with it. And he did a very, very good job.
He did, yeah. Honestly, he really did. He took a lot. He really did a lot with that role. Especially the main thing that I really liked too is that they let him, use his native language, Spanish, in the movie, to speak with a lot of the other characters too when he needed to. It's like, it's like real police work. You're going to use your tools and everything to get the job done, whatever you have to do.
Exactly. Whatever assets you can flaunt, you're going to use to get the job done at the end of the day.
Exactly.
And even then, using, like you said, again, him speaking Spanish, using whatever tools he can, even just as a performer for Michael Pena, he was able, as convincing as he was in the more intense and serious moments, again, he very much sold it in the more comedic moments. He was able to just, again, flaunt everything that he had. Any particular emotion or dynamic that, he had to do, he did. He really did.
Oh, yes, he did. Talking about this movie, it gets me a little choked up. I'm sorry.
It's fine. Listen, you it's obvious that you like the movie very much. So, again, putting our final stamp on the movie, given everything good about this movie, and again, some slight negatives for the most part, this is gripping from beginning to end, I'm going to give this a 90.
I'm giving it 100.
You're giving it 100? Oh, damn, perfect score. All right, shit. You heard it here first, folks. I don't think I've ever reviewed anything on here and given it 100. I've given some stuff that have been close, but I don't think I've ever given it 100. So this is real talk history, folks.
I'm glad I made it.
Yeah. So I think Jordan, thank you very much for coming on today. I think this is the third time that you've been on the show, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Birds of Prey review, Invisible Man review, and now this. I feel like there was something else. Whatever, you're in the lead. Whatever, you're definitely in the lead. My brother's a close second. But either way, no matter how many times you end up coming on, I always have a great time. And you always bring a lot to the table. So, Jordan, thank you very much for coming on as per usual.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Anytime. All right, I'll talk to you later, all right?
All right, sounds good.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, so I guess to continue and end off the show as well, I'm going to talk about my top 10 films of the 1970s. Now, I know what you're thinking. Last episode, I did my top 10 movies of the 90s. Why aren't I going to the 80s? Well, the reason for that is because I was looking through all the movies that I'd seen from the 80s to assemble some kind of list for the show. And I was thinking about some other movies that, I haven't seen in a while, or hell, haven't even seen at all. And I'm like, what, maybe I should watch these first, or watch them again before forming my top 10 list. So I said, screw it, let me go to the 70s first. Maybe I'll watch a few more by the time the next episode comes around. Then I'll go back to the 80s and then continue on downward for, after that. So I'm going to do the 70s. And just a little bit about the decade, of course. This is a huge decade for film. This is probably my favorite decade in terms of movies. There are so many iconic films that came out, and I think this is apparent alone in just the amount of honorable mentions that I gave for films from this particular decade. It was very hard to iron out this list. And just before I go into the actual list itself, again, I've been trying with these top 10s to kind of trim down exactly what it is I'm saying about each film, because, again, I'm noticing the amount of time that this segment usually takes up in comparison to the rest of the show. So, again, I'm really trying hard to just, make things just a bit briefer, or more brief, and, with no promises, of course, but I think I might nail it this time. So just to start things off, I'm going to list my honorable mentions for top 10 films of the 1970s, and they are MASH, A Clockwork Orange, Love Story, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Rocky, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, The French Connection, The Godfather Part 2, Taxi Driver, and Murder on the Orient Express. Alright, and coming in at number 10 from 1973 is American Graffiti. Where were you in 62? In the early 60s, a close group of friends spent their last night together going off on all sorts of hijinks and adventures before setting out to live their adult lives. The film was directed by George Lucas, was written by Lucas, Gloria Katz, and Willard Huck. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. There's a Y in the middle of there. And it stars Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, Cindy Williams, Charles Martin Smith, Paula Matt, Candy Clark, and Mackenzie Phillips. Now, one of the things that makes this movie stand out so much to me is the warm retro vibe that this movie gives off. Like I said, it takes place in 1962, and everything from the sets to the costume design to the soundtrack. The movie has a terrific soundtrack. If you're into solid old goodies that kind of make you remind you of your grandparents in the time that they grew up in. So all that kind of help get you drawn into California in the early 60s. And it's a very funny movie, very entertaining. Again, like all these, kinds of different characters, like going off on all sorts of their own hijinks and adventures and just getting into all kind of mayhem. And, it's kind of like one of these films where I don't know how much of the plot there is, so to say, but there are a lot of intersecting storylines about, again, all these four friends just trying to make the most of their last night of childhood, I guess if you want to say, the last night of innocence. If there's something about it that it feels very relatable, as crazy as things get in this film, and at the same time, it is very bittersweet, and I think that bittersweet impact comes in towards the end of the film, when it says exactly what happens to these characters, after the course of the story is done. And it's kind of surprising that George Lucas went from doing this coming-of-age, teen film to doing something like Star Wars, which, again, is very much at the other end of the spectrum in terms of genre movies. But honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed this movie when I watched it. It's not only one of the defining teen films, it's one of the defining coming-of-age films, in my opinion. And when it comes to those two particular genres, I'm very surprised that as much acclaim as this film got, I'm very surprised that this movie isn't talked about as much as movies like, say, The Breakfast Club. All right, number 9, again from the same year, is The Exorcist. The Exorcist follows a mother as she finds two priests to perform an exorcism after her daughter is possessed by a malicious entity. The film was directed by William Friedkin, with a screenplay by William Peter Blatty. The film is based on his novel. And the film stars Ellen Burstyn, Jason Miller, Linda Blair, Lee J. Cobb, and Max von Sydow. Max von Sydow, who unfortunately passed away very recently. May he rest in peace. He had a very long and illustrious career. And now, going to the actual film itself. Now, one of the things that amazes me so much about this movie is just how well crafted it is and how great the special effects are, considering the time that it came out. And again, this is the early 70s. Now, I think when it comes to at least us as moviegoers today, like when it comes to scary things or special effects from yesterday, we're a little jaded. We're a little bit more used. We're not as impacted as they might have been when they first saw it. But at the same time, when I first watched this movie, and I thought about certain images that I remember from the film, or like certain sequences that they did, I'm like, wow, A, how did they do that back then? And B, what was everyone else thinking when they first watched this film back in the early 70s? Because again, they weren't used to seeing things in movies that we're used to seeing today. So I kind of wish that if I could go back to a period in time and kind of, wipe my slate clean and kind of have a fresh perspective on everything and watch this movie then, I absolutely would, because I probably wouldn't be able to sleep for weeks after watching this movie. There's of course a religious aspect to it all, and as coming from someone who's kind of religious himself, the kind of horror that speaks the most to me is the one that kind of infuses religious themes in there, which this movie does. It does it in a very kind of chilling fashion. Again, even just with the how the story is told all around. One of the things that I love when a horror movie is able to accomplish, I love it when it's able to accomplish that it has so much more going on outside of just you being scared. Because there's a lot going on with each of the characters and, like, everything that they have in their backstories and going on in their lives. Again, this mother, is struggling to cure her daughter in a way. There's a certain internal conflict that one of the priests performing the Exorcist has in with him. And it just makes you, those conflicts, all that baggage brings an extra weight to the film. And it makes you feel like it makes you care just a bit more about these seemingly ordinary people in this, extraordinarily terrifying situation. And again, going back to the whole, how well crafted the movie is and the special effects, the ending climax, again, like the final battle, so to say, is on all fronts is one of the most mesmerizing sequences I've ever seen in film. So this is I know horror doesn't usually get a lot of love at the Oscars, but this one did, and it definitely deserved it. This is a masterclass in horror filmmaking. Number 8, The Deer Hunter from 1978. The film is about a small industrial Pennsylvania community and the effects that the Vietnam War has on the residents of the town. The film is directed by Michael Cimino, written by Cimino, Derek Washburn, Louis Garfinkel, and Quinn K. Redeker, and stars Robert De Niro, Meryl Streep, John Cazale, John Savage, George DeZundra, Chuck Aspergen, and, of course, Christopher Walken. Now, of course, The Deer Hunter is one of the things that makes the film stand out is not only just how epic the movie is. The movie's about 3 hours long. Yeah, about 3 hours long, and it's just placed on such a huge scale between, again, everything that's going on in their Pennsylvania town and all the emotional implications that this particular war has on that particular town. To, of course, these 2 or 3 men from, their community getting drafted to serve in the war and everything that they go through and everything they do to struggle and just try to make it out with their sanity, or, even if they don't make it out with their sanity, just everything that they go through in general. There's a highly emotional core to this film, and that's in large part due to A, the story, and B, the kind of poignant direction from Michael Cimino. This definitely I don't know if Michael Cimino served in the Vietnam War, but this definitely feels like, it feels like he did, whether he did or he didn't, because there seems to be a very personal and, just a very personal and human touch to it coming from his direction, and all around, there are stellar performances. Of course, you have Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken leading and stealing the show, in my opinion, and especially Robert De Niro. This is peak De Niro. This movie came out in the late 70s. This is when De Niro was definitely at the height of his career, and it just shows how he was able to reaffirm himself as one of the best, dramatic talents of that particular time, and this performance is no exception to that. Number 7 from 1979 is Apocalypse Now. A U.S. soldier in the Vietnam War is tasked with assassinating a rogue colonel. The film was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, based on the novel by Joseph Conrad, and it's adapted for the screen by Coppola and John Milius, and stars Martin Sheen, Robert Duvall, and Marlon Brando. And as you may have noticed, this film, once again, is about the Vietnam War, and it's obvious that, since the Vietnam War lasted from, I want to say, mid to late 60s starting in the mid to late 60s and ended in, like, the early to mid 70s, since this came out in 79, it's obvious that everyone was still very much kind of healing and coming to terms with everything that happened in the Vietnam War, and that's obvious in just how many films in this particular time period and stretching out through the 80s as well how many of those films came out and just happened to do with the Vietnam War. Now, just going into what makes this film different, I feel like a lot of other films about this particular war, and most wars in general, go for a very, of course, gritty. This movie is gritty, but at the same time, they go for the more realistic approach, whereas this movie doesn't feel that way. This movie, in a way, feels kind of haunting, and there's a very mysterious feel to it, and at the same time, almost trippy. They just drop some narcotics all over the film, all over the film reel for this particular film. I was trying to think of a better joke there, and it just wasn't happening, folks. I'm out of ammo as far as that. But putting all that together, you get a very different experience than what you would get from most Vietnam War films, again, in my opinion. And with that trippy feel that this movie seems to have, there's almost like a kind of fantastical element that seems to be associated with this film. At least that's the that's the feeling that I got from it. So you kind of have this, trippy war movie combined with this, like, adventure fantasy. It feels just feels very different. And on top of all that too, there's a greater emphasis on, like, the psyche. There's a more psychological emphasis with this particular film, which that again ramps up the overall intensity for it as well. And just going on, I'm just talking about what happened for them to actually be able to make this movie. I think everything that could have gone wrong with making a film went wrong. Martin Sheen had a heart attack. Either a heart attack or a stroke, was one of those two. Marlon Brando showed up, overweight out of nowhere when he obviously wasn't supposed to, so had to change the lighting scheme just for his scene alone. It was something else. And I think about everything that happened to me during my senior thesis film, and I thought that was bad until I heard about everything that happened with this movie, and I'm like, wow, by comparison, I'm a little bitch. So I'm just gonna shut up about my senior thesis film. So again, this is widely regarded as not only just one of the greatest war films ever made, but just one of the greatest films ever made. It's on top films of all time lists. Everywhere you go, AFI, and again, I think that's in large part just due to the very unique approach that they go with talking about the Vietnam War. Number 6, Jaws. Aided by a marine biologist and veteran sailor, a New England police chief battles a rampant man-eating shark plaguing the small town. The film is directed by Steven Spielberg, with a screenplay by Peter Benchley and Carl Gottlieb, and is based on the novel by Peter Benchley. The film stars Roy Schneider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw. The suspense in this film, especially for its time, I feel like how not only maturely, but at the same time just masterfully executed that the suspenses in this film kind of set the ground for a lot of other films that followed it. And this movie also set the ground for the traditional summer blockbuster. I noticed there are certain elements between this particular film and another Spielberg film, Jurassic Park. There's also, I think on top of just the suspense, I don't think it would be nearly as convincing or nearly as unsettling if it wasn't for the technical craftsmanship. Now, I know a lot of people, or at least, Steven Spielberg himself, kind of complain about the shark and say, like, how dated it was or how annoying it was to work with. Honestly, I think it was worth it, especially for, the effect that it had. It never really seemed that dated to me, but I just know that it was a pain in the ass to work with. And again, of course, that particular shark itself, for one particular scene, contributes to the whole element of unsettling horror. And Steven Spielberg definitely applies, some of that more sentimentality some of the more sentimental, really humanist touch that he's kind of known for with his films. And once again, he has been accused of being too sappy, but I think this is another film where that works out perfectly, because in a lot of, monster movies, there's such a big emphasis on, like, oh, the monster's so scary, oh, what the monster's doing is so, terrifying and whatnot. But then, this movie in particular, and I'm really just realizing this now, this movie in particular seems to put more of an emotional emphasis on the consequences of everything that the monster's doing. Like, okay, like, what if you lost a loved one to, like, something like this happening? Or, what if you were the person taking this risk to fight off this monster? Look at all the stuff that you would be leaving behind. Look at how much you have left to lose. And so I think that part of the emotional core of the movie definitely makes it stand out just a bit more, even if we don't really realize it as much. And even then, too, this movie wouldn't be nearly as memorable as it was if it wasn't for the trio of not only stellar performances, but just layered characters. I think on movies like these, they don't really take as much time to develop the people that are going into these scary situations. But, of course, and again, like I said, spectacular action, layered characters, and then, of course, who could forget the music? Number 5 from 1974 is Chinatown. Chinatown is directed by Roman Polanski, written by Robert Towne, and stars Jack Nicholson, Faye Dunaway, and John Huston. And it follows a private detective during the Great Depression as he's hired to investigate alleged infidelity, and he gets caught in a melting pot of corruption and deceit. Now, this is what I remember watching this film in college. I think the course was American Film in the Independent Era, and this is among the best films that we watched in that class for sure. It was something that feels very cynical about it all because of the setting that everything takes place in, like, the rampant corruption and everything that, seems to run the town. It's very cynical. There's something that feels like it's cynical and kind of bruised, if that makes sense. I think that goes down to, like, a lot of the things that not only happen in the movie, but, like, the people, just as how they start out in this particular film, the kind of characters that they are. The screenplay, very, not only razor sharp, but very complex, very tricky, very, very twisty. And visuals all help pull you in, from the production design to the cinematography. Now, again, as much as I despise Roman Polanski as a human being, this film, again, this showed his talents as a filmmaker, and that's all I'll say about him. And this film was kind of led by Jack Nicholson. He's on screen for much of the film's duration. And of course, as per usual with Jack Nicholson, he's easily one of the best actors ever to grace the silver screen. He totally knocks it out of the park. And just everything that this movie culminates into kind of defines, like, it basically sums up the movie. Like, particularly when I talk about just, like, the cynicism and I guess just lack of faith in everything in that particular setting, if that makes sense. Number 4 from 1976 is Network. The film follows a mentally unstable television anchor as he's exploited by a ruthless executive for his rants about society in order to not only gain viewership but profit for their own company. The film is directed by Sidney Lumet and is written by Paddy Chayefsky and stars William Holden, Peter Finch, Faye Dunaway, Beatrice Straight, Robert Duvall, and Ned Beatty. Now, this film opened me up to Sidney Lumet as a filmmaker. I think the direction of this movie is just absolutely brilliant. You really feel like, you're in there. As outrageous as this movie can be at certain points, it never takes you out of it. Everything about this movie just pulls you in, from the cinematography to all the performances, which across the board are flat out amazing. This is definitely one of the great motion picture cast ensembles for sure. There's something about this film that feels both timely and timeless. And again, going back to what I was saying about, like, some of the things that happen in this movie feel just a bit outrageous, but at the same time, as outrageous as they feel, they still comes off as stuff that could happen today, whether we even know about it or not. And I think that is in large part due to the script from Paddy Chayefsky. Now, this is definitely one of my favorite screenplays. There's something about it that feels just a bit overwritten, but that's never a bad thing, at least in this movie, because the dialogue and all the different character stories that are going on, everything's just seamed together so perfectly. Now, again, this movie came out in 1976, which means that it was a Best Picture nominee, which happened to lose to Rocky in a year that Taxi Driver was in the running as well. But honestly, out of all the movies from that particular year that I saw, I would have given Best Picture to Network. There's just, for whatever reason, even though this movie is talked about a decent amount because of certain scenes with Peter Finch's character, Howard Beale, this feels like one of those movies that, for whatever reason, at least in my mind, just isn't talked about enough. It isn't talked about nearly as much as it should be. Number 3 from 1979 is Kramer vs. Kramer. The film follows a New York admin as he must rebond and spearhead parenting duties over his son after his wife leaves him out of nowhere. The film is directed and written for the screen by Robert Benton, based on the novel by Avery Corman, and stars Dustin Hoffman, Justin Henry, Jane Alexander, and Meryl Streep. Now, given the central plot line for the movie, things would seem a bit cut and dry as far as a conflict between the man and his estranged ex-wife. And don't get me wrong, obviously, at least in my opinion, like, how could you ever run on your kid? I think he's definitely in the clear no matter how you slice it, at least, again, depending on how he handles his parenting duties, of course. But one of the things that I think makes this movie kind of interesting is that Meryl Streep's character, Dustin Hoffman's character's ex-wife, they make her character standing just a bit more formidable than you might think. Again, obviously, you can't excuse running out on your kid. You never can. But again, when it comes to everything with the child custody proceedings and everything like that, they make the fight much harder for Dustin Hoffman's character than you would originally think. A lot of that, of course, does come from the challenges that Dustin Hoffman's character Ted Kramer, for all the challenges that Ted Kramer faces, while out of nowhere having to be like the sole parental unit, and it just makes me think, as someone who, of course, is always thinks very far ahead, and wants his own kids someday. I can't help but watch this movie and wonder, like, okay, if I was ever in that situation, how would I go about handling it? How would I be able to manage? I really don't know. I'd like to think I would, but nothing is certain. I don't know how I'd handle I don't know how I'd handle kids, even if I didn't have someone to help me out, let alone if I was just practically doing it by myself. All that while trying to balance a career. So again, a film like this is really just a testament to parenthood, to fatherhood, and just shows exactly what it means to be a parent in the most unexpected and harshest of obstacles that are thrown your way. And this entire film is, of course, anchored by Dustin Hoffman's incredible performance as Ted Kramer. This movie wouldn't mean nearly as much as it does if it weren't for the performances. Again, Dustin Hoffman's terrific. Everybody across the board, and in particular Justin Henry. I believe he's the youngest Oscar nominee in history. If he's not the youngest, he's definitely one of the youngest. And he, of course, especially the emotional discipline that you need to have for that particular role, to have it at that young of an age, is quite spectacular. Number 2, from 1971, is Fiddler on the Roof. Before the Russian Revolution, a poor Jewish milkman must marry off his 3 daughters, all the while facing the growing threat of anti-Semitism. The film is directed by Norman Jewison, based on the stage musical by Joseph Stein, adapted for the screen by Joseph Stein. And the film stars Chaim Tupol, Norma Crane, Leonard Frey, Rosalind Harris, Michelle Marsh, Neva Small, and Paul Michael Glazer. And I really hope that I said all those names correctly once again. Now, this is a beautifully directed film. Everything about this movie is epic, from the runtime to the cinematography to the production design to even just the story and everything that the story covers. Again, this tale of family, this tale of faith and breaking with tradition and against all the threats that are coming up that threaten your tradition. There's this one line from the movie, and again, I don't know if this is in the stage musical as well, but this is one line from the film that basically sums up the whole film and the central character, Reb Tevye, played by Chaim Tupol. And there's this one scene where one of his daughters, without giving away too much, wants to marry off someone that Tevye does not approve of, and this is not the first time that something like this has happened. And of course, he becomes very angry at this point. He feels threatened, and he goes, "How far can I bend back before I break?" I may have butchered that line just a little bit. And I think it's such a powerful line because it thinks, because there's a difference between being open-minded and accepting new things and just losing exactly who you are. And to what limit, do you start to lose the person that you've come to know and be secure with? And again, I think that's something that's up for everybody, of course, to find and figure out within themselves. But I just think that's it's a very impactful way to go about, again, do I embrace traditional, or do I stick with traditionalism, or do I embrace this new idea that may or may not end up being better for my family later down the road? This movie, of course, it's very funny, especially when it comes to Tevye's misquoted references to, the quote-unquote good book. And against all that humor, there's a lot of emotion and sentimentality to balance it all out. This is, of course, the famous sunrise-sunset scene. If I'm not mistaken, my mother danced with her father to this particular song at her wedding, and just, all that's going through the minds of everyone involved with this special day. It really hits you. It's just like, okay, how do I guide these two people who have made a sacred bond to each other? Like, oh, what's in store for them? What's in store for me? It's all kind of touching. And again, it's just one of those things that, like, even though this takes place over 100 years ago, there are certain conflicts that are just timeless. There are certain human experiences that just never go away. All right, number 1. This should honestly come as really not much of a surprise if you know anything about pop culture or movie culture, but my number 1 movie of the 1970s is The Godfather. Coming to us all the way from 1972, an aging crime patriarch transfers control of his empire to his reluctant son. The film is directed by Francis Ford Coppola and is based on the novel by Mario Puzo. and it's adapted for the screen by both Puzo and Coppola, and stars Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, James Caan, Diane Keaton, John Cazale, and Talia Shire, and Robert Duvall. Now, this, at least in my point, from my view, and from the view of many others as well, is the gangster genre's defining film. This is the 1970s defining film. This is Francis Ford Coppola's defining film. And again, depending on who you talk to, this is film's defining film. This is widely regarded as one of the greatest movies of all time. And that is, it's very well earned. It's well deserved. This is one of those movies that gets everything right, especially for its time. This is such a huge step forward for movies and just showing what exactly you can do with movies in terms of just storytelling and character and dialogue and direction and acting. I can go on and on and on. There is not one thing about this movie that isn't famous, that isn't unforgettable, that isn't legendary. Everyone in this movie gives outstanding performances. There's not a weak note in this entire film. This film is just under 3 hours long, and once again, while it feels slow in a good way. It never drags. Given just how epic this is in terms of not only all the emotion that it covers, but just in terms of the scope of the story, it just never once definitely, I don't know if I'd say it feels melodramatic. There's, of course, a very dramatic and heavy quality to this entire story, but it never once feels pretentious. Everything that's in this movie deserves to be there, and everything in this movie just only raises the standard for not only the movie itself, but just for filmmaking in general. This is honestly one of the greatest movies of all time. I don't know how much you can really criticize about this movie other than maybe the length, but again, long movies never really bother me. But this is one of those movies where the hype is very much well earned. This movie is almost 50 years old, and it's aged very well. This is a perfect movie. It doesn't get it can't really get any better than this, at least in my opinion. But this is a very famous movie. It also ended up getting one of the greatest sequels of all time. The Godfather Part 2 is just about as well received as Godfather Part 1. Of course, there's The Godfather 3, which never happened. When it comes to this particular movie and just how much this movie has going for it and how wide of an audience this movie seems to have such a big influence on, it's stunning. It's it's honestly astonishing. But at the same time, I get it. I get why this movie has as big of a reach and has had that big of a reach for as long as it has. And on that wonderful note, I know this is a simpler episode today, and you need one of those every once in a while. That's fine. So thank you for joining me anyway. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to viewing more Netflix parties, seeing what other new releases get sent to video on demand that I'm able to watch, or other streaming services like Netflix or Amazon Prime that I actually am able to watch. And I just, look forward to improvising everything during this crazy historic pandemic that we all seem to be white-knuckling it through together. So don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. And yes, not only is the show on YouTube and Spotify, but now it just made its way onto SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts on iTunes. I finally got around to putting it on iTunes. So please check it out. Don't forget to share and tell everyone you know as well. I hope I'm getting better as your host, and I hope I'm finding enough decent material to talk about with you on the show, again, while we're going through all this craziness and while I'm not really able to go to the movies because everything's getting shut down. So until next time, I'm Joe Acierno. This has been Real Talk.